The winter of 1876 hit Montana Territory like a sledgehammer. Snow piled up higher than wagon wheels, and the wind cut through everything like a razor blade. Most folks had learned to stay close to their fires during months like these, but cattle don't take care of themselves. Red Mackenzie pulled his worn hat down tight against the bitter cold as he made his morning rounds. His boots crunched through the snow that had fallen overnight, leaving deep prints behind him. The cattle were huddled together near the shelter he'd built for them, their breath creating little clouds in the freezing air. He counted them quickly, all there, thank goodness. Losing even one head of cattle could mean the difference between making it through winter or going hungry. Red had been working this land for nearly 8 years now. He'd come west after the war, looking for a fresh start like so many other men. His small ranch wasn't much to look at, a simple log cabin, a sturdy barn, and enough pasture to keep his small herd fed during the good months. But it was his, and that meant everything to a man who'd grown up with nothing. The tensions between settlers and the local tribes had been getting worse lately. Red tried to stay out of it, but a man couldn't ignore what was happening around him. There had been raids on both sides, angry words at the trading posts, and more than a few good people lost to the violence. Most of his neighbors had strong opinions about the situation, but Red found the whole thing heartbreaking. He traded with tribal members plenty of times and found them to be decent folks, just trying to take care of their families like everyone else. As he walked along his fence line, checking for damage from the storm, something caught his eye near the old oak tree at the corner of his property. At first, he thought it might be a bundle of rags that had blown in with the wind. But as he got closer, his heart nearly stopped. It was a child. A small figure lay crumpled in the snow, barely moving. Red dropped his tools and ran, his boots slipping on the icy ground. When he reached the spot, he saw it was a native boy, probably no older than 8 or 9. The child's lips were blue with cold, and his breathing was so shallow Red had to put his ear close to the boy's mouth to make sure he was still alive. The kid was wearing nothing but a thin shirt and torn pants. No coat, no shoes, no protection against the deadly cold. His dark hair was matted with ice, and his small hands were nearly frozen solid. Red could see the boy's ribs through his shirt. This child hadn't eaten a proper meal in days. Maybe weeks. For just a moment, Red hesitated. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to keep walking. Getting involved with a native child during these troubled times could bring nothing but problems. His neighbors might see it as taking sides. The boy's people might think Red had done something to hurt him. Either way, it could mean trouble for a man trying to live quietly on his small ranch. But looking down at that tiny, freezing figure in the snow, Red knew he couldn't walk away. This wasn't about politics or sides or anything complicated. This was about a child who would die if someone didn't help him right now. Red scooped the boy up in his arms. The child weighed almost nothing, like holding a bundle of sticks. His skin was ice cold, and he didn't even stir when Red lifted him. That scared Red more than anything. A healthy child would have at least opened his eyes. Carrying the boy as carefully as he could, Red hurried back toward his cabin. The wind seemed to cut right through both of them, and Red found himself talking to the unconscious child as he walked. "Hold on there, little fellow. We're going to get you warmed up. You're going to be just fine." But even as he said the words, Red wasn't sure he believed them. The boy looked so small and fragile, and Red had no idea how long he'd been lying in the snow. Sometimes the cold got into a person so deep that even a warm fire couldn't bring them back. Red kicked open the door to his cabin and headed straight for the fireplace. He had a good fire going already, and the heat hit them both like a wave. Red laid the child down on his own bed, close to the fire, but not too close. He'd seen what happened when frozen skin got heated up too fast. The boy's clothes were soaked through with melted snow. Red knew he had to get the wet things off, but he worked carefully, trying not to move the child too much. The boy's skin was pale with cold, and Red could see old bruises and scratches that told a story of hard traveling. Red wrapped the child in every blanket he owned, piling them on until only the boy's face showed. Then he went to work building up the fire even higher. The cabin was already warm, but this child needed all the heat Red could give him while the boy warmed up. Red put a pot of water on to boil. He didn't have much in the way of food, winter supplies were always tight, but he had some beef broth that his neighbor Mrs. Patterson had given him. She'd told him it was good for just about anything that ailed a person. Red found himself pacing while he waited for the broth to heat up. He kept looking at the boy, watching for any sign that he was getting better. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, the child's breathing seemed a little stronger. The blue color was starting to fade from his lips. When the broth was ready, Red sat on the edge of the bed with a spoon. The boy's eyes were still closed, but Red thought he might be closer to waking up than sleeping now. "Come on, son," Red said. "Quietly. You need to try to drink something." He lifted the boy's head gently and touched the spoon to his lips. At first, nothing happened. Then the boy's mouth opened slightly, and Red was able to get a few drops of the warm broth inside. The child swallowed without opening his eyes, which Red took as a good sign. Little by little, spoonful by spoonful, Red got nearly half a cup of broth into the boy. Color was starting to come back to the child's face, and his breathing was definitely getting stronger. Red pulled a chair up beside the bed and sat down to wait. He'd done what he could for now. The boy was warm, he'd gotten some food in him, and he was breathing better. The rest was up to the child's own strength and whatever luck they both had. As Red sat there watching over the sleeping boy, he couldn't help but wonder what had happened to bring a child so far from home in such terrible condition. Where was his family? How long had he been wandering alone? And what was Red supposed to do with him once he got better? But those were questions for later. Right now, Red's job was simple: keep this child alive and warm. Everything else could wait until morning. Outside, the wind howled around the cabin like something wild and angry. But inside, beside the crackling fire, a small boy slept peacefully under a pile of blankets, watched over by a cowboy who decided that some things mattered more than playing it safe. Red woke up before dawn, just like he had every day for the past 8 years, but this morning was different. Instead of the usual silence of his empty cabin, he could hear soft breathing coming from his bed. For a moment, he'd almost forgotten about the boy he'd found half frozen in the snow. He moved quietly across the wooden floor, trying not to make any noise. The fire had died down during the night, leaving just glowing embers, so Red carefully added some wood to get it going again. The boy was still sleeping, wrapped up tight in those blankets, but his color looked much better than it had the night before. Red put on his boots and coat to go check on his cattle. The morning air was sharp and cold, but not as bitter as the day before. His breath made little puffs of steam as he walked to the barn. The cattle were fine, huddled together and chewing on the hay he'd put out for them when he got back to the cabin. The boy was awake. Big dark eyes stared at Red from across the room, watching his every move. The child didn't say anything, just watched with the careful attention of someone who'd learned to be cautious around strangers. "Morning," Red said softly, keeping his voice gentle. "How are you feeling?" The boy didn't answer, but Red hadn't really expected him to. He could see the wariness in those young eyes, the uncertainty of a child who didn't know if he was safe or in danger. Red went about his morning routine slowly, making sure not to make any sudden movements that might scare the boy. He got the coffee pot going and started heating up more of that beef broth. The child needed food more than anything else, and Red could see how thin he was now that he wasn't bundled up against the cold. "You hungry?" Red asked, holding up the pot of broth. This time the boy nodded slightly. It was the first real response Red had gotten, and it felt like a small victory. Red helped the boy sit up, supporting him with pillows from his own chair. The child was weak, but he was alert and seemed to understand what was happening around him. Red fed him the broth spoon by spoon, just like the night before, but this time the boy was awake and helping Dot after the broth. Red tried to think of what else he could give the child to eat. His winter supplies were pretty basic: beans, some dried meat, flour for biscuits, and not much else. But he did have a few precious eggs from his chickens, and he figured this was as good a time as any to use them. Red scrambled 2 eggs in his old iron pan, making them soft and easy to eat. The boy watched everything he did with those careful eyes, taking in every detail of Red's movements around the small cabin when Red offered him the eggs. The boy ate them slowly, like someone who hadn't had a real meal in a very long time. Red found himself smiling at the sight. There was something deeply satisfying about watching a hungry child eat. "That's it," Red encouraged. "You need to get your strength back." After breakfast, Red realized the boy's clothes were in terrible shape. The shirt was more holes than fabric, and the pants weren't much better. Red didn't have any clothes that would fit a child, but he did have an old shirt that he could cut down to size. He worked carefully with his knife, trying to make something that would at least cover the boy properly. It wasn't pretty, but it was warm and clean. The boy watched him work, and Red thought he saw a hint of curiosity in those dark eyes. "There," Red said, holding up the makeshift shirt. "It's not much, but it's better than what you had." The boy allowed Red to help him change clothes, though Red could tell he was still nervous about being touched. There were more bruises and scratches on the child's thin body, evidence of whatever hard journey had brought him to Red's fence line. As the day went on, Red found himself talking to the boy even though he rarely got any response. He talked about his cattle, about the weather, about anything that came to mind. Somehow, the silence in the cabin felt less lonely with the boy there, even though they couldn't really communicate. "I bet you're wondering where you are," Red said, while he worked on mending one of his own shirts. "This is Montana Territory. My name's Red Mackenzie, and this here's my ranch." "It's not much, but it's home?" The boy was sitting up in bed now, wrapped in blankets and watching Red work. He seemed stronger than he had that morning, though still very weak. "I wish I knew some words in your language," Red continued. "Might make this whole thing easier." Red had picked up a few phrases in various tribal languages over the years, mostly from trading at the posts in town. He tried a few words he remembered, simple things like hello and friend. The boy's eyes widened slightly when Red attempted what he thought might be Lakota. Though Red was pretty sure his pronunciation was terrible. By afternoon, Red was starting to worry about food again. The boy needed more than broth and eggs if he was going to get his strength back, but Red's supplies were limited. He had been planning to make those supplies last until spring, and now he was feeding 2 people instead of 1. Red looked at his small flock of chickens scratching around in the yard. Those chickens were precious. They gave him eggs through the winter, and he'd been planning to use them to start a bigger flock come spring. But the boy needed meat, needed the kind of nourishment that would help him heal. It was a hard decision, but not really a decision at all. Red caught one of his hens and prepared it for cooking. The smell of chicken roasting filled the cabin, and Red saw the boy's nose twitch with interest. "This is going to be good," Red told him. "Real food to help you get strong again." When the chicken was ready, Red carved off the most tender pieces and gave them to the boy. He ate slowly but steadily, and Red could see that he was already looking a little less fragile than he had that evening. As they sat by the fire, Red tried again to communicate with the boy. He pointed to himself and said, "Red," several times. Then he pointed to the boy with a questioning look. The boy hesitated for a long moment, then spoke so quietly Red almost missed it. "Dakota?" Red's face lit up. "Dakota? That's your name?" The boy nodded, and Red thought he saw the hint of a smile cross the young face. "Well, Dakota, it's good to meet you properly," Red said. "You're welcome to stay here as long as you need to." As night fell, Red made up a bed for himself on the floor, so Dakota could have the real bed. The boy protested weakly, but Red waved him off. "You need the rest more than I do," Red said. "Besides, I've slept in worse places." Before they went to sleep, Red banked the fire carefully to make sure it would last through the night. He wanted to keep the cabin warm for Dakota, who still seemed to feel the cold more than he should. "Tomorrow we'll work on getting you even stronger," Red said into the darkness. "And maybe we can figure out how to get you back to your family." But even as he said it, Red found himself hoping that wouldn't happen too quickly. There was something about having the boy there that made the long winter feel less lonely. For the first time in years, Red's little cabin felt like it might actually be a home. Red's eyes snapped open in the pre-dawn darkness. Something was wrong. After years of living alone on the frontier, a man learned to trust his instincts. And right now, every instinct Red had was screaming that something wasn't right. The cabin was quiet except for Dakota's steady breathing from the bed. The boy had been getting stronger each day, eating better and even helping Red with small chores around the cabin. But that wasn't what had woken Red up. It was the silence outside. Usually, Red woke up to the sound of his rooster crowing, followed by the cattle moving around in their pen and the chickens clucking as they searched for food. This morning there was nothing. No sounds at all from his animals, which was strange enough to make the hair on the back of Red's neck stand up. Red sat up slowly on his makeshift bed on the floor, listening hard. Still nothing. Even the wind, which had been howling around the cabin for days, had died down to an eerie stillness. It felt like the whole world was holding its breath. Moving carefully, so he wouldn't wake Dakota, Red pulled on his boots and reached for his coat. His rifle was hanging on pegs near the door, and he considered taking it, but something told him to leave it where it was. Instead, he just pulled on his hat and moved toward the door. The wooden floor creaked under his feet, and Red winced at the sound. Everything seemed louder in the strange quiet of the morning. Dakota stirred slightly but didn't wake up. The boy had been sleeping better the past few nights, which Red took as a good sign that he was healing. Red put his hand on the door handle and paused. In all his years living out here, he'd never felt quite like this. It wasn't exactly fear, but it was close. It was the feeling a rabbit might get just before a hawk swooped down from the sky. He opened the door slowly, just a crack at first. The cold morning air hit his face, but that wasn't what made him freeze. It was what he saw. In that narrow gap between the door and the frame, a horse. A painted horse standing perfectly still about 50 yards from his cabin. And on that horse sat a warrior in full war paint. Red's heart started beating faster, but he forced himself to stay calm. Maybe it was just one man. Maybe he was lost or looking for something. Red had dealt with individual tribal members before, and most encounters had been peaceful, even friendly. But as Red opened the door wider, his blood turned to ice water in his veins. The warrior wasn't alone. Not even close to alone. They were everywhere. In every direction Red looked, there were more horses, more warriors. They formed a perfect circle around his property, sitting so still they might have been carved from stone. Red blinked hard, thinking maybe he was seeing things, maybe he was still asleep and this was some kind of nightmare. But no. This was real. Red stepped outside onto his small porch, and now he could see the full scope of what surrounded him. There had to be at least 200 warriors out there, maybe more. They sat on their horses in complete silence, weapons ready, war paint gleaming in the early morning light. Every single one of them was looking at his cabin. Red's mouth went dry. His hands started to shake, and he had to grip the porch railing to steady himself. In all his years on the frontier, through Indian wars and cattle rustling and every other kind of danger a man could face, Red had never seen anything like this. It was like looking at an army. The warriors were arranged in perfect formations as if they'd been planning this for days. Some carried bows with arrows already notched. Others held rifles or war clubs. Many had shields decorated with symbols Red didn't recognize. Their horses were painted with designs that seemed to tell stories Red couldn't read, and they were all waiting, but waiting for what? Red tried to think of what he might have done to bring this kind of attention to his little ranch. He'd always tried to be fair in his dealings with everyone, regardless of their background. He'd never cheated anyone in trade, never stolen cattle or horses, never bothered anyone who didn't bother him first, then hit him like a punch to the gut. The boy sleeping in his cabin was native, and Red had found him alone, far from any camp or village. What if these warriors thought Red had taken the boy? What if they believed Red had hurt him or kidnapped him? Red's knees felt weak. If that's what they thought, then no amount of explaining would save him. He'd heard stories of what happened to settlers who were accused of harming native children. Those stories didn't end well. He looked around the circle of warriors again, trying to spot their leader. Near the front of the group, directly facing his cabin, sat a man who was clearly in charge. He was older than most of the others, with gray streaking through his long black hair. His horse was bigger and more elaborately decorated than the rest. Feathers hung from his hair and his lance, and the paint on his face was more intricate than the others. This man sat perfectly still, staring at Red's cabin with eyes that seemed to look right through the wooden walls. There was something about his face, something in his expression, that made Red's stomach clench with worry. The chief, because that's obviously what he was, raised his hand slightly. It was barely a movement, but every warrior in the circle responded to it. They shifted on their horses, adjusting their grips on their weapons, getting ready for whatever came next. Red realized his hand had moved toward where his gun belt usually hung, but he wasn't wearing it. He'd left his weapons inside the cabin, which now seemed like either the smartest or the stupidest thing he'd ever done. Smart, because coming out armed might have been seen as a threat. Stupid, because now he had no way to defend himself if things went badly, not that it would matter much. Even if he had every gun he owned, there was no way one man could fight off 200 warriors. This wasn't a fight he could win. This wasn't even a fight he could survive for more than a few minutes. Red forced himself to breathe slowly, to think clearly despite the fear that was trying to take over his mind. There had to be a reason they hadn't attacked yet. If they just wanted him dead, he'd already be dead. The fact that they were waiting, watching, suggested they wanted something else. But what? The morning sun was starting to come up behind the circle of warriors, casting long shadows across Red's property. The light caught on their weapons and war paint, making them look even more intimidating than they had in the dim, pre-dawn light. Red noticed that some of the younger warriors looked restless, eager for action. But the older ones, especially the chief, remained perfectly calm and still. They were waiting for something or someone. A cold wind picked up, whistling around the cabin and making Red's coat flap against his legs. The sound seemed incredibly loud in the silence that had settled over everything. Even his cattle, usually vocal in the morning, were quiet. It was as if every living thing for miles around could sense the tension in the air. Red's throat felt dry as dust. He wanted to call out, to ask what they wanted, to try to explain about Dakota. But something told him that speaking first would be a mistake. This was their show, and they would decide when and how it played out. All Red could do was stand there on his porch, surrounded by more enemies than he'd ever imagined, and wait to see if he would live to see another sunset. Red had been standing on his porch for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. The circle of warriors hadn't moved, hadn't made a sound. They just sat there on their horses, watching and waiting. The tension was so thick Red could almost taste it in the cold morning air. Then he heard something that made his heart skip a beat. It was coming from inside his cabin, the soft sound of footsteps on wooden floors. Dakota was awake. Red's mind raced. What would happen when the boy came outside? Would the warriors think Red had been holding him prisoner? Would they attack before Red could explain? There were so many ways this could go wrong, and Red couldn't think of a single way it could go right. The cabin door creaked open behind him. Red didn't dare turn around, didn't want to take his eyes off the warriors for even a second. But he could feel Dakota's presence behind him, could sense the boy moving closer. "Stay inside," Red whispered, barely moving his lips. "Please, son. Just stay inside." But Dakota didn't listen. Red heard the boy's bare feet on the wooden porch, and then Dakota was standing beside him. The child looked out at the circle of warriors, and Red expected him to be afraid, to run back inside or hide behind Red's legs. Instead, something incredible happened. Dakota's face lit up with recognition and joy. He let out a cry that was part laugh, part sob, and started running toward the warriors. Red's heart nearly stopped as he watched the small boy race across the snowy ground in nothing but the makeshift clothes Red had given him. "Dakota, no!" Red shouted, starting to run after him, but then Red saw something that made him freeze in his tracks. The chief, the stern-faced leader who had been sitting so still and intimidating, suddenly moved. His weathered face transformed completely, harsh lines melting into an expression of pure relief and joy. The chief slid down from his horse, faster than Red would have thought possible for a man his age. He met Dakota halfway across the yard. Dropping to his knees in the snow and pulling the boy into his arms, Red watched in amazement as the fierce warrior held Dakota close, speaking rapidly in their native language. The chief's voice was thick with emotion, and Red could see tears streaming down the older man's face. The other warriors had broken their perfect silence too. Calling out and talking excitedly among themselves, slowly the pieces started to fall into place in Red's mind. This wasn't a war party come to attack his ranch. These were people who had been looking for Dakota. Family, maybe? Or members of his tribe who had been searching for a lost child. The chief stood up, still holding Dakota, and looked directly at Red. For a moment, Red felt that old fear creep back up his spine. The man's eyes were intense, studying Red's face like he was trying to read his soul. Then the chief did something that surprised Red even more than everything else that had happened. He handed Dakota to one of the other warriors and walked slowly toward Red's cabin. Not in a threatening way, but with the careful, respectful approach of someone who wanted to talk. Red stayed where he was on the porch, not sure what else to do. The chief stopped about 10 feet away and looked at Red for a long moment. Then he spoke, his English heavily accented but clear enough to understand. "You are the one who found the boy." It wasn't a question. Red nodded anyway. "Yes, sir. Found him near my fence line, half frozen, had to help him." The chief studied Red's face again, then looked back at Dakota, who was being fussed over by several of the warriors. They were wrapping him in warm blankets and checking him over, making sure he was all right. "How long?" the chief asked. 3 days, Red answered. "Found him 3 days ago." The chief nodded slowly. "He has been missing for 8 days. We have been searching," he gestured to the warriors around them. "All of us. Day and night." Red was starting to understand the full scope of what had happened. This wasn't just a few people looking for a lost child. This was an entire tribe that had mobilized to find one small boy. Every warrior, by the looks of it, had dropped whatever they were doing to join the search. "He's your grandson?" Red guessed, seeing the way the chief kept looking at Dakota with such fierce love and protectiveness. The chief's face softened slightly. "Yes, my daughter's son, my Dot." He paused, searching for the English word. "My heart." Red felt a lump form in his throat. He thought about how frantic he would be if he had a child and that child went missing. How he would search every inch of the territory, call on every friend and ally, never stop until he found them. The chief took a step closer to Red. "You fed him, gave him warm clothes, made him strong again." Red shrugged, feeling embarrassed by the attention. "Just did what anyone would do. Kid was hurt and hungry. Couldn't leave him to freeze." But even as Red said it, he knew it wasn't true. Not everyone would have helped. Plenty of his neighbors would have kept walking, would have told themselves. It wasn't their problem. The tensions between settlers and tribes had made a lot of people hard, suspicious of anyone who looked different. The chief seemed to know this too. "Not everyone would help," he said quietly. "Many of your people, they fear us. They would let a child die rather than help." Red didn't know how to respond to that, mostly because he knew the chief was right. So he just stood there, waiting to see what would happen next. The chief called out something in his own language, and Dakota came running back over. The boy looked much better now, warmer and more secure, surrounded by his people. But when he reached Red, he did something that surprised everyone. Dakota threw his arms around Red's waist and hugged him tight. He spoke rapidly in his native language, pointing back at the cabin, then at Red, then at himself. Red couldn't understand the words, but the meaning was clear. Dakota was telling his grandfather how Red had taken care of him. The chief listened to his grandson's story, his expression growing more serious with each word. When Dakota finished, the chief looked at Red with something that might have been respect. He says, "You gave him your own food, your own bed? You killed one of your chickens to make him strong." Red felt his face getting red. "Like I said, just did what needed doing." "He says you were kind, that you spoke gently and never frightened him, even though he could not speak your language." The chief reached out and placed a heavy hand on Red's shoulder. "You could have taken him to the fort, could have traded him for money or favors, Could have let him die and saved your food for yourself. Red shook his head. Never would have done any of those things. He's just a child. Yes, the chief said, and there was something in his voice that Red couldn't quite identify. Just a child, but he is my child, and you saved his life. The chief removed his hand from Red's shoulder and stepped back. He spoke again to the other warriors, his voice carrying clearly across the yard. Then he looked back at Red, and for the first time since this whole thing started, Red saw him smile. We have much to discuss, Red Mackenzie, the chief said. Much to discuss. The chief stepped back and spoke to his warriors in their native language. His voice carried authority, but there was something else in it too, something that sounded almost ceremonial. The warriors listened intently, and Red could see their expressions changing as they looked at him. What had started as suspicious, potentially hostile stares was turning into something completely different. These men were looking at Red with what could only be described as respect. What's your name? The chief asked, turning back to Red. Red Mackenzie, Red answered, still not quite believing this conversation was really happening. Red Mackenzie. The chief repeated slowly, as if testing how the words felt in his mouth. I am called Thunder Horse, chief of the Lakota band you see before you. Thunder Horse. Even Red, who didn't know much about tribal politics, had heard that name before. Thunder Horse was known throughout the territory as a fierce warrior and a wise leader. Some of the settlers at the trading post spoke his name with fear, others with grudging respect. Chief Thunder Horse, Red said, trying to show proper respect. I'm honored to meet you, sir. Thunder Horse nodded slightly, then continued speaking to his warriors. As he talked, Red noticed that several of the younger men were looking disappointed. They'd probably been hoping for a fight, for a chance to prove themselves in battle. Instead, they were getting a peaceful conversation on a front porch. Dakota was still standing close to Red, holding on to his hand. The boy seemed reluctant to let go, even though he was clearly overjoyed to be reunited with his people. Red found that both touching and a little heartbreaking. In just 3 days, they'd formed a real bond. Thunder Horse finished speaking to his warriors and turned his full attention back to Red. You have done something important, he said. Not just saving a life, but showing honor to a people who are often treated as enemies. Red shifted uncomfortably. He wasn't used to this kind of formal talk, and he certainly wasn't used to being the center of attention for 200 armed warriors. I just did what felt right, Red said. Any decent person would have done the same. Thunder Horse shook his head. No, many would not. We have searched for 8 days. We found tracks of other men who passed near where Dakota was lost. They saw him. They chose to keep walking. The words hit Red like a punch to the stomach. Other people had seen Dakota and left him to die. Red couldn't imagine how anyone could walk away from a child in need, regardless of who that child was or where he came from. That single quotes S ... double quote started to say, then stopped. He didn't have words for how that made him feel. That is why what you did matters, Thunder Horse continued. In our tradition, when someone saves the life of our children, especially the life of a chief's grandson, they become part of our family, part of our protection. Thunder Horse reached up and began removing something from around his neck. It was a necklace made of leather and beads, with eagle feathers hanging from it. Even Red, who knew little about native customs, could tell it was something important and sacred. This has been worn by chiefs of my family for 5 generations. Thunder Horse said, holding the necklace up so Red could see it clearly. My father wore it, and his father before him. Red's eyes widened. Sir, I can't take something like that. It's too important. It is important, Thunder Horse agreed. That is why you must wear it. Before Red could protest further, Thunder Horse stepped forward and placed the necklace around Red's neck. The leather was soft and worn smooth from years of wear, and the beads were beautiful colors that seemed to catch the morning light. From this day forward, Thunder Horse said loudly, speaking as much to his warriors as to Red, Red Mackenzie is under the protection of the Thunder Horse band. Any who harm him will answer to us. Any who threaten his land or his cattle will face our warriors. A cheer went up from the assembled warriors. They raised their weapons in the air and called out what Red assumed were words of agreement and support. The sound was so loud it seemed to echo off the mountains in the distance. Red felt overwhelmed. Just an hour ago, he'd thought he was about to die. Now he was being adopted into a tribe and promised protection by some of the fiercest warriors in the territory. "I don't know what to say," Red managed. "Say you will remember," Thunder Horse replied. "Say you will remember that honor exists between all people, regardless of the color of their skin or the language they speak." Red nodded, his throat too tight to speak for a moment. When he found his voice again, it came out rougher than usual. "I'll remember." Thunder Horse turned to Dakota and spoke to him gently. The boy nodded and came over to Red one more time. He said something in Lakota, then hugged Red again, even tighter than before. "He says thank you," Thunder Horse translated. "He says you have a good heart, and he will never forget your kindness." Red knelt down so he was at Dakota's eye level. "You take care of yourself, little man. And listen to your grandfather. He's a good man who loves you very much." Dakota smiled and nodded, even though Red was pretty sure the boy didn't understand most of the English words. But understanding didn't require language. The meaning was clear enough. Thunder Horse lifted his grandson up onto his horse, settling him securely in front of the saddle. Then he mounted behind the boy, taking up the reins. "We will not forget this debt," Thunder Horse said, looking down at Red from his horse. "Your kindness will be repaid many times over." The chief raised his hand, and all around the ranch, warriors began turning their horses and preparing to leave. What had taken them probably hours to set up was dissolving in just minutes. Soon they would disappear back into the wilderness, as quietly as they had come, but before they left, Thunder Horse had one more thing to say. "The winters here are hard," he called down to Red. "Sometimes cattle get lost in storms or wolves threaten herds. Sometimes bad men come to steal what honest men have worked for." Thunder Horse smiled. "You will find that your troubles will be fewer now. My warriors have good eyes and strong arms." As the war party began to move out, Red stood on his porch and watched them go. Dakota, riding with his grandfather, turned back to wave at Red until they disappeared over the first hill. Soon Red was alone again on his ranch. The morning was quiet once more, with only the normal sounds of his animals and the wind through the trees. If it weren't for the necklace around his neck, Red might have thought the whole thing had been a dream. Over the following weeks and months, Red learned that Thunder Horse had been true to his word. Wolves that had been troubling his cattle seemed to disappear. The rustlers who had been working the area moved on to easier targets. And sometimes when Red was working his fence line or checking on his herd, he would find fresh deer meat hanging from a tree branch, or a bundle of warm furs left near his barn. Red never saw who left these gifts, but he knew. Somewhere out there, warriors were watching over him, making sure he was safe and well provided for. It was a strange feeling for a man who had lived most of his life relying only on himself, but it was also a good feeling. Red had learned something important. That winter morning when he'd found a dying child in the snow, he'd learned that kindness was never wasted, that doing the right thing mattered more than playing it safe, and that honor could bridge any divide between people years later. When other settlers asked Red how he managed to prosper on his small ranch while others struggled with wolves and thieves, he would just smile and touch the eagle feathers that still hung around his neck. "Guess I've just been lucky," he would say, but Red knew it wasn't luck at all. It was something much more powerful than that. It was the result of treating a lost child with the same care he would have wanted for his own son, regardless of what that child looked like or where he came from, and that Red thought was a lesson worth learning.